Hello and welcome to Edexcel 1-9 History GCSE Revision. Today we're going to be looking at Paper 1 Crime and Punishment with a focus on the influence of religion through time. We'll be starting this video with the Saxon period, which begins in our time period 1000 up to 1066, and those are our three main key words: the Wergild, trial by ordeal and church crimes. England officially becomes Christian round about the 7th century AD, and it's here where we replace the Blood Feud, this system of violence between families, never-ending vicious circle, with the Wergild. This is where, instead of hurting other people, you pay the victim's family compensation. This could be based on any injuries that have been caused, or the status of the person which you have killed. People in the Middle Ages genuinely believed that God had true power. He could move mountains, create rivers of blood. He could even send a plague of locusts if you said his name in vain. Therefore, when juries couldn't decide a trial for themselves, they would go to a trial by ordeal. This is when a person would use a hot iron or hot water, and God would help them overcome this trial if they were truly innocent and if they were telling the truth. Just before the Battle of Hastings, the king is Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor was a very religious and moral king, so he wanted everybody to behave the same way. Therefore, moral crimes were introduced and they were dealt with by the church. Things like witchcraft, blasphemy, or even playing football on a Sunday could result in you coming to church, being whipped in front of your friends and family, and having to say sorry to God. And then, of course, you have the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where the Normans conquer England and introduce lots of changes, especially religious ones. Here we're going to focus on William I, trial by combat, sanctuary, benefit of clergy, the murder of Thomas Beckett, and changing attitudes towards women. So we'll start with William I. He was probably more religious than Edward the Confessor. There are lots of reasons why William invaded England in 1066, but before he did so, he wanted to get permission from the Pope. Invading England to try and clean up the church gave him a really justified reason for invading another country. It also meant that when he did invade and conquer England, he would make wide-sweeping religious changes. And one of those changes was trial by combat. This is very similar to trial by ordeal, but instead of hot water or cold water or hot iron, the accuser would fight the person that he is accusing of that crime, and the person that's telling the truth would be victorious. Didn't matter how big you were or how technically gifted you were with a sword, the winner would be helped by God, technically. The Normans also believed that the church was so powerful that it could protect you from the law. Criminals could seek sanctuary for up to 40 days, whereby they would be able to hide from the local constable or the sheriff and his posse, and they would seek protection from the church. The church would then give them a punishment, and they would be then sent to go on a pilgrimage, a religious mission to cleanse their soul of any sin, and they would probably be kicked out of that village for good. In the later Middle Ages, a system of church courts developed to deal with crimes that were committed by the clergy, i.e. priests, nuns and bishops. Their punishments tended to be more lenient, and this was known as benefit of the clergy. It's called benefit of the clergy because they believed that clergymen, i.e. priests and nuns, people that worked for the church, were not answerable to the king. They got their instructions from God. Therefore, the only person that could put another priest on trial was a priest. Many kings obviously did not like the fact that they had little power over priests. In particular, Henry II. He got into a really big argument with the most powerful priest in the country, Archbishop Thomas Beckett, to the point where Archbishop Beckett got murdered in his own church. The Pope at the time threatened to send Henry II to hell and the whole of England to hell in case Henry did not apologise. The king obviously did apologise, therefore demonstrating how powerful the church was. After the Norman conquest, attitudes towards women began to change. Beforehand, Saxon women were seen the same as Saxon men. In some ways, they were more important. They were the people that owned all of the property. However, after the Normans, women were seen as evil due to the evil female characters in the Bible. People like Eve, Jezebel, Delilah. Therefore, women were stripped of property, became lesser citizens, and they were even punished in public by their husbands and other males. However, the most significant changes in religion certainly came during the early modern period, 1500 to 1700. The obvious place to start here has to be the Reformation and its impact on vagrancy, heresy, of course the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, and witchcraft. Alongside wanting to pay for all of his wars with France, trying to rival the Pope for power of the Church, and wanting a divorce, Henry breaks away from the Catholic Church. He creates his own Church of England in 1534, which is later known as the Reformation, and here he tries to persuade people to become Protestant. He isn't really too bothered if they are Catholic as long as they agree to be Protestant in public. Underneath his son, Edward VI, Puritans and Protestants begin to become more influential. Without monasteries, which is where monks used to live, there was nobody to look after the homeless. Therefore, more homelessness led to more thieving and more begging and more trouble. Therefore, vagrancy became a more serious crime. Underneath the 1547 Vagrancy Act, you'd be whipped upon your first offence, given slavery or execution underneath your second. Edward's older sister Mary was a Catholic. To try and reverse the changes that her father and brother had put in place, she began the Counter-Reformation. So instead of Protestants punishing Catholics, it was now the other way around. Bloody Mary burns hundreds of Protestants, nearly 300 to be precise, in just 5 years. She does this to try and demonstrate her divine right. This is a belief that kings and queens got their power from God. Therefore, heretics, people that had a different religion to the king or queen, were challenging that God. If you challenge the king or queen's God, then you challenge their power. So for many people, heresy was often seen as treason. Therefore, burning somebody at the stake seemed like an appropriate punishment. Elizabeth solves the heresy problem in 1559 when she creates the Act of Uniformity, essentially bringing in a law where everybody has to be the same religion. However, from 1569 onwards, there are lots of Catholic plots to try and assassinate Elizabeth, most of them centred around her own cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. Therefore, with every Catholic plot, there are more anti-Catholic fines and harsher treatment towards Catholics in general, such as keeping many of them under house arrest. So when James I becomes king, many Catholics feel that they're now going to get a fair crack of the whip. Unfortunately, from 1603 to 1605, James I is even harsher towards Catholics than Elizabeth is. These Catholic fines are known as recussancy fines. And James uses these recussancy fines so often that he upsets quite a lot of Catholic people. In particular, a man called Robert Catesby, who plans to blow up Parliament with the help of demolition expert Guy Fawkes. They transport 36 barrels of gunpowder underneath the Houses of Parliament with the plan of blowing up James and his Protestant government and instead installing a Catholic one, essentially a Catholic revolution. Francis Tresham notifies his brother-in-law, Lord Monteagle, about the impending plot. Guy Fawkes is captured, his friends are killed, and Mr. Fawkes is tortured until he confesses to the whole thing. He is then hung, drawn and quartered, the most brutal punishment you can get, and the Thanksgiving Act is passed. This is where Catholics are banned from voting, being part of the army, being in the law profession, and having any job to do with Parliament until 1829. Not only is James I worried about Catholics, but he's incredibly paranoid about witches. So paranoid that he writes a book, Demonology-how to catch witches. You may have heard of this when you've been studying Macbeth. This is based on the old Catholic text, the Hammer of Witches, Malleus Maleficarum, and it essentially teaches people how to spot, catch and kill witches. Heavily influenced by the church. During the Civil War in the 1640s, you got Catholics fighting Protestants, parliamentarians fighting royalists, very little government control of England, lots of people blame witches for things that are going wrong. In steps Matthew Hopkins. He uses books like Demonology and Hammer of Witches to create fake tests, and using these fake tests, accuses over 300 women of witchcraft, many of them being burnt or hanged in public. So religion has had a huge influence on crime and punishment up to this time period. However, it's in the industrial era, 1700 to 1900, that religion has a smaller influence. Here we're going to look at the arrival of science underneath the Royal Society, the end of witchcraft as a crime, the influence of Elizabeth Fry, and the use of religion in Pentonville prison. In the mid-1700s, we discover science. Groups like the Royal Society leads to lots of scientific discoveries like astrology, studying the stars, and the study of rocks, maths, medicine. All of these discoveries clash with teachings that have been led from the church. Therefore, more people start to lean towards science and teachers as opposed to the church and priests for knowledge. As a result, religion becomes less important in crime and punishment. It was the Catholic Church that was responsible for many people being accused of witches. Witches were agents of the devil and used black magic to hurt people. From 1735 onwards, judges and juries no longer believed these claims made by fake witch hunters such as those like Matthew Hopkins. Therefore, anybody that claimed to be a witch hunter was clearly a con man after your money, and instead of the witch being a criminal, it was now this person. Again, science having a big impact. Religion was still important, however, and was a good way for you to learn how to behave properly. One of the best examples of this is the work of Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry worked with female prisoners in Newgate Prison. Here she taught people how to sew, she read them Bible stories, and tried to rehabilitate them through kindness. Whereas before religion was very important for influencing law and order, now it's a way to try and rehabilitate people. However, Elizabeth Fry's methods of rehabilitation through religion are taken to the extreme by people in Pentonville. Hard labour is used alongside Bible reading to rehabilitate criminals. However, this doesn't really work. As we know, the silent and separate system didn't really rehabilitate people, it actually made them worse. Long periods of isolation and not talking to anybody led to mental health issues and unfortunately lots of suicides. And arguably the hardest topic to apply religion to is today, 20th century until 2000. We're going to look at conscientious objectors, the concept of human rights, liberalisation which takes place during the 60s and 70s, and how you could try and link religion to the abolition of the death penalty. After the government tried forcing people to go to war in 1916 with the Military Service Act, many people refused. They refused on the grounds of a conscientious objection to military service, essentially moral or religious grounds. Even though this was stated as being allowed in the actual law itself, many who refused to fight on religious grounds were punished. They were treated very harshly in tribunals and they were even spat at. Many conchies, as they were known, were sent off to the war front anyway, put in prison, or maybe even shot. However, when we were fighting Hitler in World War II, the government became a bit softer towards conscientious objectors. We couldn't exactly send troops over to fight Hitler, who was punishing Jews for having different religion to the Germans, when we were doing the same thing to the conscientious objectors. It'd be seen as hypocritical and unfair. During the 50s, 60s and 70s, a process of liberalisation takes place. This is where we start to become more accepting and more open-minded towards people of different ethnicities, sexualities, religions, and of course, women being treated more fairly. People were no longer bound by old religious stereotypes, and in the 60s and 70s particularly, we become nicer and more accepting of each other. You could argue that this process of humanisation starts way before the 60s and 70s. Samuel Romilly, most famous for campaigning against slavery, and Robert Peel, the person that reduces the bloody code from 200 crimes down to 5, already started this change in attitudes towards becoming more human. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that after miscarriages of justice, people like Derek Bentley, Ruth Ellis, Timothy Evans being unfairly hanged, that we start to change our opinion towards the death penalty. Therefore, in 1965, we removed the death penalty for all crimes except treason, and in 1998, the death penalty is completely abolished due to lots of different reasons, but also moral reasons.